The soldier arrived with no name on his chart, 6 armed men surrounding his gurney, and a wound that 3 field dressings couldn't stop. Before the trauma doors finished swinging open, a Navy officer grabbed the chief surgeon by the arm and said 4 words that sounded from my emergency bay: "He cannot die here." The surgeon smiled. He had performed over 800 operations. He had never lost a patient he didn't want to lose. And the quiet nurse, standing at the back of the room, the one nobody ever looked at twice, already knew that tonight that record was about to end in the worst possible way. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because it's the story you're about to kind that will keep you up at night. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. There are nights in a trauma unit when the air changes before anything happens. Before the radio crackles. Before the automatic doors slam open. Before the first set of boots hits the linoleum at speed. Something shifts, a pressure change, an almost imperceptible frequency. And the nurses who have worked those floors long enough learn to feel it the way ranchers in open country feel weather coming off the mountains before the clouds have formed. Not instinct, exactly. Something more deliberate than instinct. Pattern recognition worn so deep into the body that it no longer requires conscious thought to operate. Rebecca Hale felt it at 11:43 p.m. She was charting at the nursing station, her pen moving across a paper form, because the electronic system had been down for 40 minutes and nobody had figured out why. The overhead lights in the corridor were on their nighttime dimming cycle, that particular shade of institutional yellow that makes everyone look slightly unwell. The unit was quiet. 2 patients in observation, 1 post-surgical in the step-down bay, and a 14-year-old with a broken wrist in room 4 who had cried out herself to sleep 2 hours ago. Rebecca set her pen down. She looked toward the ambulance bay doors at the far end of the corridor. They were closed. There was no sound from beyond them. No radio traffic, no approaching sirens, nothing that should have caused her to stop writing and look up. She looked anyway. 31 seconds later, they opened. Harwick Regional Medical Center occupied the southeastern edge of Callaway, Wyoming, a facility that had been expanded twice in 20 years, and still somehow felt too small for what it was asked to do. It served 4 counties, a stretch of federal highway that collected accidents like a drain collecting leaves, and the rotating population of seasonal workers who came through the National Forest corridor every spring and fall. It was not a level 1 trauma center. It had 38 inpatient beds, 2 operating suites, a trauma bay with 3 stations, and an imaging suite that had received a new CT scanner 18 months ago and had not yet finished paying for it. The staff were competent. Some of them were exceptional. Most of them had learned to do more with less for long enough that doing more with less no longer felt like a compromise, it just felt like the job. What came through the ambulance bay doors was a gurney moving at a speed that made its wheels shudder against the floor joints. The man on it was unconscious, intubated in the field, with an oxygen saturation reading of 89 on the portable monitor clipped to the rail. A field dressing was packed beneath his left lower ribs, dark and saturated through, in a way that suggested the bleeding had not slowed during transport, but had instead found a rhythm of its own. He was large, broad-shouldered, with the particular density of a man who had spent years building his body for functional rather than aesthetic purposes. His face was slack gray at the edges of his lips. 4 men jogged alongside the gurney. 2 more moved ahead of it, not running but walking fast, moving through the corridor ahead of the patient in a way that cleared the path without anyone being asked to move. They wore civilian clothing, dark pants, plain jackets, nothing with insignia or rank, but they did not move like civilians. Their eyes swept the room in overlapping arcs, systematic, unhurried, despite the speed of everything around them. They were not looking for exits. They were not looking for the bathroom or the family waiting area. They were assessing the room for variables they hadn't counted for. And they were doing it automatically, the way breathing is automatic. Rebecca was already on her feet and moving before the gurney reached the nursing station. The lead paramedic was a woman named Carla Dunn, who had run Callaway County EMS for 11 years and had transported patients through blizzards, through floods, through one memorable spring where a semi had jackknifed on the highway interchange and produced 6 simultaneous critical casualties. Carla was not easily disturbed. She looked disturbed. Fragmentation injury, left lower quadrant, possible retained foreign body. BP was 88/60 at scene, dropped to 74 on transport. We pushed 2 liters normal saline, minimal response. GCS was 5 when we loaded, dropped to 3 en route. He's been intubated 11 minutes. Rebecca moved alongside the gurney, her left hand finding the patient's radial pulse. It's weak, faster than it should have been, while her right hand lifted the edge of the field, dressing just enough to assess. 2 saturation zones. She registered that without changing her expression. The chart in Carla's hand listed a name, Thomas Vance, 44. Below the name, a single line, contact, military liaison on scene. No next of kin, no insurance information, no address. Trauma Bay 1, Rebecca said, and the team moved. She had been at Harwick for 6 years. Night shift for 4 of those by choice. People sometimes asked her why she preferred nights, and she usually said something about expect the quieter pace, the way the unit felt different after midnight. What she didn't say, what she had never said to anyone at Harwick. At Harwick was that nights reminded her of the only other kind of work she had ever been trained to do, which had also happened mostly in the dark, and which had required exactly the same calibration of alertness and economy, and knowing when to speak and when to simply act. She was 37 years old. She had dark hair that she kept pulled back during shifts and loose the rest of the time. Her face in repose was difficult to read, not unfriendly, but opaque in a way that made some of the newer nurses uneasy until they worked with her long enough to understand that the opacity was not coldness. It was concentration. She was always processing more than she was showing, and she had decided long ago that showing everything she was processing was a luxury that situations rarely afforded. She helped transfer Thomas Vance to the trauma bay table. His skin was cool and clammy under her hands. His color was the particular shade of grayish pale. That meant his body had been shunting blood away from the periphery for longer than the paramedic's timeline accounted for, which meant the injury had been doing its work before anyone reached him. And the 2 liters of saline had bought time, but not margin. She was cutting his jacket away when Dr. Harrison Wolk arrived. Wolk was Harwick's chief trauma surgeon. He was 51, stocky, with gray at his temples, and the kind of deliberate walk that communicates authority in hospital corridors without requiring any additional signals. He had trained in Philadelphia, worked at 2 urban Level 1 centers, and come to Callaway 3 years ago under a rural healthcare recruitment initiative that had initially offered him considerably more than his urban salary and had since quietly reduced that differential in ways that he had never entirely stopped resenting. He was genuinely skilled. He had operated on injuries that would have killed patients in less than experienced hands, and he had a legitimate record that he had earned through work. The problem was not his skill. The problem was that his skill, its self-assessment of his skill, had grown so tightly fused over the years that they had become functionally inseparable, which meant that anything that questioned the one felt to him like an attack on the other. He walked in, reviewing something on his tablet. One of the military men stepped directly into his path before he reached the table. This patient is under protective status. The man's voice was controlled, neither threatening nor deferential, the voice of someone trained to communicate information clearly in high-stress environments without contributing additional stress. We need to confirm who will have access to this room. Wolk looked up from the tablet. He looked at the man. He looked at the 5 others positioned around the periphery of the bay. He looked at the patient. I'm the surgeon. My team has access. Everyone else steps back. We'll need to remain in the room. That's not how trauma bays work, sir. The man didn't raise his voice. We remain in the room. Something in the phrasing not aggressive, not a request, not quite an order, but occupying the precise space between those things made Wolk pause. He recalibrated. People with that particular quality of stillness did not argue with in emergency departments. He had learned that during his time in Philadelphia, where law enforcement occasionally escorted patients in under circumstances that were above his clearance level to understand. Perimeter only, Wolk said. You do not approach the table. He moved past the man without waiting for a response. Rebecca had completed her primary survey and was running the secondary. She noted the wound tract, the field dressing saturation pattern, the peripheral vascular status, the respiratory response to ventilation. She reached for the portable X-ray that the paramedics had flagged, taken in the field. Poor resolution, soft tissue detail limited, and looked at it. She looked at it for a long time. Reflected longer than X-rays from the field usually warranted, because field X-rays were usually rough, and the information they contained was limited, and experienced providers learned to hold them loosely. She was not holding this one loosely. The fragment was visible on the image, a bright, dense shard, approximately 2 centimeters in its longest dimension, situated lateral to the lower pole of the spleen. What held her attention was not its location. It was its axis. The long dimension of the fragment was angled obliquely, not aligned with any obvious trajectory from a wound that entered laterally. It had rotated. Objects rotated inside cavities when surrounding tissue shifted, when pressure differentials changed, when the patient moved or was moved during extrication. Objects that rotated could migrate. Dr. Wolk. She held the image toward him. The fragment axis is oblique on this lateral film. It may have moved from its initial position. If it migrated posteriorly during extrication, we could have involvement of the retroperineal structures, the vascular bundle in that region. Wolk looked at the image. She watched his eyes move across it, the brief compression of his expression that meant he was considering rather than dismissing. Then the compression released. Grade 3 splenic laceration is consistent with the presentation. The fragment position is lateral. He turned back toward the table. CT will give us definitive anatomy. The bleed pattern on the dressing concerns me more than the imaging. She kept her voice even. There are 2 distinct saturation zones, which suggests the character of the bleeding changed at some point during transport. That pattern is consistent with Rebecca. The flatness, the particular flatness that preceded the kind of dismissal that was dressed up as reasonableness. Field dressings saturate in variable patterns based on how they're applied, how the patient moves, how much pressure EMS maintained. I appreciate you flagging it. Let's get definitive imaging before we theorize. I'm not theorizing. I'm asking you to consider a posterior vascular component, performance. I've been doing this for 22 years. He said it without heat. Factually, the way someone recites a credential. CT suite is ready? The tech confirmed it was. Let's move. Rebecca said nothing more. She turned to the supply cabinet. She pulled 2 Satinsky clamps and 2 DeBakey vascular clamps from the vascular tray and placed them on her instrument stand. She placed them at the front of the stand, closest to her reach. Wolk noticed as he was pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. We're going to CT, not to the OR. Yes, then those aren't needed. They're staged. Put them back, please. She looked at the clamps. She looked at the patient, at the gray undertone of his skin, at the thready pulse that she had felt against her fingertips, at the second saturation zone on the field dressing that had dried to a darker color than the first and occupied a position slightly superior and posterior to the primary zone, which was exactly where you would expect blood to pool if the source was not the splenic parenchyma, but something behind it. She put the clamps back in the cabinet. She left the cabinet door open. The CT took 9 minutes to acquire, and 7 more for the radiologist on call, a man named Dr. Singh, who was working remotely from his home in Sheridan to render a preliminary read. Wolk reviewed the images at the workstation in the imaging corridor with the radiology tech beside him, and the resident, a third year named Marcus, looking over his shoulder. Rebecca stood 4 feet back, where she could see the screen. Wolk called his findings to the room with the confidence of a man whose preliminary assessment had been confirmed. Grade 3 splenic laceration with a moderate parasplenic hematoma. Fragment is lateral, see here, adjacent to the inferior pole. He pointed. No active extravasation on the venous phase. Retroperitoneal fat planes are intact. He straightened. We take him to OR2, explore probable splenectomy, and retrieve the fragment. Rebecca studied the images on the screen. She saw what he saw. She saw the laceration, the hematoma, the fragment in its lateral position, the apparently intact retroperitoneal fat planes. She also saw, or thought she saw, a slight asymmetry in the contour of the left renal vein at the superior margin of the image, a subtle flattening that could have been a rendering artifact from the patient's respiratory motion during acquisition, or could have been something exerting pressure on the vessel from an adjacent structure. It was at the edge of the image's diagnostic confidence. She could not call it definitively. She was not a radiologist. She was not a surgeon. But she had seen a renal vein that looked like that before. She had seen it in much worse conditions than this, where the next step after recognizing it was not ordering a consult, but using whatever her hands could find to address it before the window closed entirely. She said nothing. She had already said what she could say. She had flagged the fragment migration. She had flagged the dressing pattern. Wolk had heard her and made his decision, and the decision was within the range of defensible surgical judgment, given the imaging, and she understood that. She was not a surgeon. The limits of her role were real, and she had spent enough time in environments where ruled boundaries were functionally irrelevant to understand exactly how much those boundaries mattered in environments where they were not. She went to prepare the OR. The scrub nurse for the case was a man named Pete Garland, who had been at Harwick for 8 months, transferred from a facility in Colorado where he had done primarily orthopedic cases. He was quick, technically quick, good hands, good spatial awareness, but orthopedics scrubbing and abdominal trauma scrubbing were different disciplines. And Pete was still in the phase where his competence was real, but his pattern recognition was thin. He hadn't yet accumulated enough of the specific situations that would teach him to feel before it was announced when a surgery was beginning to go wrong. Rebecca was not assigned to OR2 that night. Her assigned bay was the step-down corridor and observation. She completed her handoff for those patients, logged her assessment notes, and then walked to the corridor outside to OR2 and stood at the portable charting terminal positioned near the family consultation room. She opened a patient file. She began charting. She was not charting because she had fallen behind on her documentation. She was charting because it gave her a reason to be in that corridor, near that door, where she could hear through the gap at the base of the OR door without appearing to be listening. The military men were in the consultation room across the corridor, but the door was open a few inches. She could see 2 of them seated and 4 of them standing, the standing ones, arranged in the unconscious posture of people who have been trained to stay ready while appearing relaxed. Nobody had brought them coffee. Nobody had come to update them. The hospital did not have a good protocol for this particular situation because this particular situation had not occurred at Harwick before. The youngest of the 6 mid-30s, leaner than the others, with a quiet watchfulness that reminded her of people she had worked with a long time ago, stood slightly apart from the group near the consultation room doorway. He caught her eye once and then looked away, which was how people behaved when they were pretending not to be paying attention to someone they were paying very close attention to. Inside OR2, She could hear the rhythm of the case, Wolk's voice, directing the measured cadence of a surgeon who is working within his expectations. Instruments called for and passed. The particular phrasing residents used when they were following rather than anticipating. The soft, mechanical noise of the suction running. She charted. She listened. 38 minutes into the case, the cadence shifted. It shifted before she could have articulated what had changed a compression in the timing between Wolk's instructions. A shift in the register of his voice from deliberate to clipped, the suction note changing from intermittent to continuous. Then the anesthesiologist's voice, which had not been audible through the door gap until now, pressure is dropping, 72/42. Rebecca was on her feet before the sentence finished. She moved to the OR door and looked through the small, rectangular window. She could see the back of Wolk's gown, the drape configuration, Pete's shoulder, the anesthesiologist's face above the drape focused, tightening. She could not see the surgical field. She could see the monitor on the anesthesia machine. BP 65/38, active hemorrhage. Wolk's voice, controlled but faster. Packing going in, more lap pads. Opening the infuser, the anesthesiologist said. BP 58/34, it's not slowing. Rebecca pushed through the OR door. Wolk turned immediately. His eyes above the mask were sharp and direct and not pleased. Hale, you're not assigned to this room. I know. She stopped at the edge of the sterile field. Where is the bleeding? Posterior to the splenic hilum. I'm packing. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the position of Wolk's hands relative to where she understood the anatomy to be. She looked at the drape configuration and the position of the retractors that Marcus was holding. How much volume so far? The anesthesiologist answered without being asked to. Estimated 800 ml in the field. We're transfusing now, but we're behind. BP 52/30. I need a long Satinsky, Wolk said to Pete. Pete passed it. Wolk placed it. The monitor did not improve. It's not seated, Rebecca said quietly. Hale, the vessel is posterior to where your packing angle is reaching. The clamp isn't on the right plane. I have visualizations. Dr. Wolk, the anesthesiologist's voice, very quiet, very even. Whatever you're going to do, please do it in the next 45 seconds. BP 46/28. Wolk repositioned again. I can't get posterior control from this approach. Rebecca was already at the scrub sink. She scrubbed 30 seconds, fast, thorough, the way she had been trained to scrub when there was no time for the full sequence, and something was going to happen before the full sequence was possible. She gloved. She moved to the table. I need to look, she said to Wolk. You are not sterile, I scrubbed. I'm gloved. She met his eyes above her mask. Not challenging him, not asking permission in the way that permission asking sounds when it's really a power negotiation. Just telling him what was true. Let me look. He stepped back 1 inch. She leaned over the field. She found it in 4 seconds. Not the splenic hilum. Below and posterior to it, the fragment had migrated exactly as she had flagged in the trauma bay, and in migrating, it had come to rest against the posterolateral wall of the left renal vein at an angle that the CT had rendered as an equivocal density artifact. When Wolk had mobilized the spleen and shifted the surrounding mesentery to gain exposure, the fragment had pivoted on its own axis like a key turning in a partial lock, and the edge of it had opened the TE in the posterior venous wall. The tear was not large, perhaps 8 millimeters, but 8 millimeters in a major abdominal vein at a patient with a circulating blood volume already depleted, well below safe operating margin, was not a small problem. The packing was nowhere near it. Everything in Rebecca's internal experience went very still. Not calm exactly, stillness and calm are different things. And she had learned the difference in conditions that did not permit confusion between them. Stillness was what happened when the situation became completely clear and the options collapsed to a single path, and the body stopped spending energy on anything that was not directly relevant to walking that path. 2 fingers, she said. and placed her right index and middle fingers against the posterior cavity wall, finding the tear by the change in pressure and the direction of flow against her fingertips. The hemorrhage slowed, not stopped. I need a long Satinsky. Angled. Right now. Pete already had it in his hand. He had picked it up the moment she moved to the table, some instinct or observation driving him before his conscious reasoning caught up. Pass it. He passed it. She worked by feel, her right hand maintaining pressure on the tier, while her left guided the clamp along a path that she knew not from the CT images, which had been equivocal, and not from the OR lighting, which did not reach the posterior plane she was working in, but from a kind of spatial memory that was older than Harwick and older than Wyoming, and came from a different set of conditions entirely, with worse equipment and worse light, and a patient she had never gotten a name for who had the exact same anatomical configurations of vessel and fragment and posterior cavity wall. The clamp seated. She felt it click against the vessel wall on both sides of the tier. She released one finger. The bleeding did not increase. She released the second finger and kept her hand on the clamp, not trusting the purchase, maintaining light pressure on the instrument until she was certain it was correctly placed. Check pressure, she said. The anesthesiologist looked at his screen. A silence of approximately 4 seconds that felt considerably longer than 4 seconds. 48/26, he said. Holding. It's the drop has stopped. Nobody in the room spoke. Rebecca kept her hand on the clamp. The OR was completely silent, except for the ventilator cycling and the monitor's slow, careful, beep, slow because the heart was working hard, careful because it was still working at all. We need vascular surgery, she said. He needs formal repair, not just clamp control. Call for a vascular consult now. Marcus was already reaching for the phone. Wolk stood at the edge of the table. He had not spoken in 90 seconds. Then the OR door opened. The youngest of the 6 military men stood in the doorway. He was not in scrubs. He was not gloved. He had simply opened the door because the alarms had been audible from the corridor and no one had moved to update them. And he had reached the limit of waiting in a consultation room while the person he was, responsible for protecting, either survived or did not. He looked at the table. He looked at Rebecca. His expression did not change in any way that could have been identified as change by anyone not trained to read faces with precision. But something moved through it, not surprise. Not confusion, something that looked more like the particular quality of recognition that occurs when something you thought you completely understood reveals a dimension you had no framework for and had, therefore, simply failed to see. He looked at her hands on the clamp inside the surgical cavity. He looked at the way she was positioned, not assisting, not supporting, not supplementing. The way she was standing over that table was not the posture of someone managing someone else's emergency. It was the posture of someone managing their own. The economy of her movement, the absence of hesitation, the short, precise language she had been using with the precise language she had been the anesthesiologist for the past 3 minutes, which did not sound like the language of a nurse helping a surgeon. It sounded like the language of someone who had done this before. Not in the hospital, somewhere else. He stepped back into the corridor without being told. And as the OR door swung shut behind him, he had his phone out of his pocket. He did not call his superior. He called the person who tracked backgrounds. He gave her one piece of information. First name, last name, institution. Find everything, he said. And then he stood in the corridor outside OR 2, in Harwick Regional Medical Center in Callaway, Wyoming, and waited for an answer that he was already beginning to suspect he was not going to like. The answer came back in 11 minutes. The man's name was Garrett Solis, and he had been doing this work long enough to know that 11 minutes for a background pull was either very fast or very slow, depending on what the pull found. Fast meant the subject was in a system somewhere, flagged, categorized, already known to someone. Slow meant the subject had been scrubbed, which was its own kind of answer. 11 minutes meant Rebecca Hale was a system. He read the summary standing in the corridor outside OR2, the phone screen close to his face, the OR door still showing a strip of light at its base. He read it once quickly, and then read it again slowly, because the first pass had produced a response in him that he wanted to verify before he acted on it. Then he put the phone in his pocket and stood very still for a moment. He thought about the way she had moved to that table, the way her language had compressed into something short and load-bearing, and entirely without the hedging that civilians used when they were uncertain. The way she had placed those fingers not probing, not searching, but arriving. The way she had called for the clamp without looking up, without explaining what she needed it for, in the absolute certainty that if she asked for it, it would be there. Because in the environments where she had learned to do what she just did, the alternative to that certainty was a body count. He thought about all of that, and then he thought about the fact that Thomas was currently alive, on the other side of that door. He walked back into the consultation room. 5 faces turned toward him. "She's got him," he said. Nobody asked who he meant. Inside OR2, Rebecca did not feel like she had him. She felt like she had bought time, which was a different thing entirely, and one that people who had not worked in environments where time was the only currency available sometimes failed to appreciate. Clamp control on a renal vein tear was not repair. It was interruption. It bought the patient minutes. How many minutes depended on how well the clamp was seated, how much collateral circulation existed, how aggressively the team could replace volume, but it did not fix anything. The tear was still there. The fragment was still there. The renal vein distal to her clamp was still doing whatever the renal vein did when it was partially occluded, and the patient's blood pressure had spent the last 15 minutes below the threshold of adequate organ perfusion. "What's his urine output?" she asked. The anesthesiologist checked. "We don't have a Foley in. Get one in now. I need to know if the kidney is responding." Marcus moved to place the catheter. Wolk had not spoken in several minutes. He was standing at the periphery of the surgical field, and Rebecca was aware of him the way she was aware of most things in a room when she was focused, peripherally, without turning her head, updating his position and status, the way she updated everything else, without dedicating primary attention to any of it. He was watching her hands. His expression, above the mask, was unreadable in the way that expressions become unreadable when the person wearing them is processing something they have not yet found a framework for. Not anger. Not humility. She would not have called it humility, because humility requires a kind of conscious surrender that produces a specific softness in the face, and Wolk's face was not soft. It was more like the expression of a man who has opened a door expecting a familiar room and found something else entirely, and is still in the process of deciding what to do with the information. The vascular surgeon arrived in 7 minutes, which was fast for a middle-of-the-night call from a home in Callaway. Her name was Dr. Anita Ferris, and she was 54 years old and had trained at a vascular program in Houston and come to Wyoming for reasons that were personal rather than professional, and had never explained those reasons to anyone at Harwick. She came through the OR door still pulling her second glove on, took one look at the field, and said, "Talk to me." Rebecca talked. Short sentences, accurate sentences. The kind of handoff that communicated exactly what needed to be communicated without editorializing or seeking approval. Posterior renal vein laceration, approximately 8 millimeters, fragment adjacent, proximal and distal control, achieved with a single Satinsky across both sides of the tear. Patient's pressure was currently holding at 52/28. Urine output not yet established. Total estimated blood loss prior to clamp placement was significant, and the patient had received 3 units of packed cells and was behind on replacement. Ferris listened without interrupting. When Rebecca finished, Ferris leaned over the field and looked. "Good placement," she said. It was 2 words. It was not a compliment in the way compliments are usually delivered warmly, with eye contact, with the intention of making the recipient feel recognized. It was an assessment. a surgeon evaluating a technical outcome and rendering a verdict. The fact that the verdict was positive was incidental to the fact that it was accurate. Rebecca stepped back. "He needs formal repair," she said. "I'll circulate." "Stay scrubbed," Ferris said. "I may need the extra set." Wolk said nothing. The repair took 41 minutes. Ferris worked with the particular economy of a surgeon who had done the procedure enough times that each movement was already decided before it began. She did not narrate. She did not explain her choices to the residents unless a choice was genuinely instructive, and when she did explain, she was brief. She retrieved the fragment carefully in a way that accounted for its oblique axis and the possibility of secondary tearing as it moved, and passed it to the scrub nurse, who placed it in a specimen container with the particular careful reverence that people apply to objects that have nearly killed someone. She repaired the venous laceration with a running suture in 2 layers, tested the repair with restored flow, and watched the monitor for 90 seconds before she allowed herself to straighten. BP 7448. "Not good. Better. Urine output," she said. Marcus read from the Foley monitor. 32 mils since placement. "Coming up. Kidneys recovering," Ferris said. "To no one in particular." To the room. Rebecca had circulated throughout the repair, managing instrument counts, coordinating with the anesthesiologist on blood product orders, tracking the running tally of inputs and outputs that told the story of where the patient's body was and where it needed to go. She had not stopped moving for 41 minutes and had not drawn attention to any of it, which was the nature of good circulating. The job was to be the infrastructure that everyone else operated on top of without noticing it was there. When Ferris began closing, Rebecca stood at the back of the room and wrote her documentation. Wolk left the OR at some point during the closure. She noted it without recording it. Thomas Vance went to the surgical ICU at 3:17 a.m. His pressure on arrival to the unit was 8854, which was still below where it needed to be, but was trending in the right direction for the first time since he had come through the ambulance bay. His urine output had stabilized. His temperature was low the long surgery, and the volume replacement and had pulled heat from him, and the SIC NUFU nurses layered warming blankets, and while the intensivists reviewed the operative notes and the blood gas results and made the particular face that intensivists make when the news is not good, but is better than it was an hour ago. Rebecca completed her documentation in the OR corridor, logged the instrument and sponge counts, and gave her verbal handoff to the SICU charge nurse. Then she walked back to the step-down bay and checked on her 2 observation patients because they still existed and still required nursing care, regardless of what had happened in OR 2. Mrs. Paulson's observation bed 1 had a blood pressure of 142, Lady 8, which was higher than her goal but not alarming. The post-surgical patient in step-down had rung his call light 3 times in the past hour, wanting ice chips, which he had been told he could not have, and had rung it a 4th time to ask what time it was. Rebecca told him the time. She brought Mrs. Paulson her scheduled medications. She stood in the step-down corridor at 3:44 a.m. and allowed herself 30 seconds of not doing anything. Not charting, not assessing, not moving. She leaned against the wall and breathed. Her hands were steady. They had been steady throughout. They were steady now. She had learned a long time ago that the shaking when it came after, not during. The body understood the deal. Hold it together until the crisis passes. And then the crisis passes, and the body presents its invoice. She had 45 minutes left on her shift. The shaking could wait 45 minutes. She pushed off the wall and went back to charting. At 4:08 a.m., she became aware that someone was standing in the step-down corridor. It was Garrett Solis. He was not wearing scrubs or a hospital gown or anything that should have allowed him past the unit's access point, which meant he had either found someone to badge him through or had simply walked through a door that someone had left propped open which happened more than hospital administration liked to acknowledge. He stood at a respectful distance, not in her space, not close enough to crowd her, with his hands visible at his sides in the deliberate way of someone who has been trained to make their body language legible to people who have been trained to read it. "Mr. Solis," she said, because she had heard one of the other men address him by name during the initial entry, and she had filed it. He blinked. She had not been introduced to him. "How is he?" he asked. "Stable, improving." She kept her eyes on her chart. "You should be in the family consultation area. This corridor is restricted." "I know." He didn't move. "I wanted to talk to you." "Not the best time." "No," he agreed, "but probably better than later." She looked up from the chart. He met her eyes without flinching, but also without the particular aggressive steadiness of someone trying to establish dominance. He was simply looking at her the way people look at other people when they are trying to figure out how much of what they are thinking to say. "I had someone run your background," he said. She held his gaze. "Okay," she said. "You have a gap," he said. 7 years. Before Harwick. Before the 2-year position in Colorado before Harwick. 7 years where your nursing license is active, but your employment record is institutional." "Institutional," she repeated. "Attached to units I don't have direct clearance for." He paused. "But I have people who do." She looked back at her chart. "Mr. Solis, your patient is alive. He needs rest. You and your team should probably do the same." "You worked with the forward surgical element," he said. "Trauma nursing attachment to a special operations support unit. 3 deployments in 8 years, 2 of them in environments that are still classified above my level." She wrote something in the chart. "You left the program 6 years ago," he continued. "No explanation in the record. Just separation. Voluntary." She turned a page. "The unit you were attached to on your 3rd deployment," he said. "The mission that went wrong in the Larak Valley." Her pen stopped. Not dramatically. Not in a way that could be called a reaction. It stopped the way a pen stops when the writer encounters a word they need to consider before moving past it. "Thomas Vance was the team leader for that mission," Solis said quietly. The step-down corridor was very quiet. The post-surgical patient's call light was off. Mrs. Paulson's monitor beeped at its regular rhythm. Rebecca put the cap on her pen. She looked at Solis with an expression that told him nothing and acknowledged everything. "He survived the Larak Valley," she said. "Because of the surgical support that night," Solis said. "Which is in the record. Partially. What do you want, Mr. Solis?" "Right now?" He exhaled slowly. "Nothing. I wanted you to know that I know." And that he stopped. Started again. "What you did tonight?" "In that OR. I've seen a lot of things in a lot of operating rooms. I've never seen..." He stopped again. "You've never seen a nurse do it," she said. Not bitterly. Just accurately. He didn't deny it. "I've never seen anyone do it the way you did it. With that much certainty. Without losing anything." She picked up her pen. "He's going to want to know you're here," Solis said. "He needs sleep. He's already asking." She looked at the chart in her hands. She thought about Thomas Vance on a ridge in the Larak Valley, a different wound in a different configuration, and a darkness that the OR lighting in Harwick Regional would have seemed like daylight by comparison, and the particular sound a man made when his body had decided it was finished and the people around him had not yet agreed to that decision. "In the morning," she said. Solis nodded. He turned to leave. "Mr. Solis." He turned back. "The fragment," she said. "Make sure chain of custody is documented on the specimen. Given who the patient is, you'll want that record to be airtight." He looked at her for a moment. "Already done," he said. She nodded and went back to charting. She did not shake until 5:22 a.m., standing in the staff bathroom on the 2nd floor, with the door locked and the tap running. Her hands trembled against the edge of the sink for approximately 90 seconds. She breathed through it. She watched her hands. She had learned a long time ago not to fight the trembling. It was the body settling its accounts, and The accounts were legitimate, and fighting them just made it take longer. After 90 seconds, her hands steadied. She splashed water on her face, dried it, and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been awake for too long and would need to sleep before she could think clearly about anything. She did not look like someone who had done something exceptional, which was accurate. She had done what the situation required, which was what she had always done, and the doing of it had never felt like more than that. What felt like something was the name Solis had said. Lorac Valley. She had not heard those two words spoken aloud in 6 years. She had read them once, in a document she was not supposed to have access to, and had accessed anyway through a connection that had since retired. A document that listed the official casualty count, and the official summary, and the official determination of what had gone wrong on that ridge. And every word of that document had been so precisely and deliberately wrong that reading it had felt like reading a description of a fire that carefully avoided mentioning that there. She turned off the tap. She unlocked the bathroom door. She had 38 minutes left on her shift, and there was a patient in step-down who had probably rung his call light twice more while she was in the bathroom. And Mrs. Paulson's 5 a.m. Blood pressure check was due in 12 minutes. She went back to work. The morning shift arrived at 6:45, and Rebecca gave her handoff with the methodical thoroughness she applied to every handoff, not because she felt methodical, but because methodology at the end of a long shift was the only thing standing between the next nurse and the mistakes that tired nurses made when handoffs were sloppy. She stayed 20 minutes past her shift end to answer questions, which she always did, and left the unit at 9. She did not go home. She went to the surgical ICU waiting area on the 3rd floor and sat in a chair near the window and drank the coffee she had bought from the vending machine in the main lobby, which tasted like hot water that had heard a rumor about coffee, and waited. At 8:22 a.m., the SICU charge nurse came to the waiting area and found her. "He's awake," the nurse said. "He's been asking for someone named Hale since about 7:30. She paused. "I'm guessing that's you, yes," Rebecca said. "Visiting isn't technically until 10. Rebecca looked at her. The charge nurse looked back. "Room 6, she said. 5 minutes. And if Dr. Harmon asks, I didn't see you." Thomas Vance was awake in the way that people were awake after major surgery and significant blood loss, conscious, aware, operating at approximately 60% of his usual capacity, and pushing through it with the stubbornness of a man who had spent decades treating his own limitations as negotiating positions rather than fixed facts. He was intubated through the night, but had been extubated an hour ago, and his voice when he spoke had the particular roughness of a throat that had recently had a tube in it. He was looking at the door when she came in. He had been looking at the door, she suspected, for a while. She stopped at the foot of the bed. She looked at him, his color, his respiratory pattern, the urine output on the Foley bag, the drip rates on his IV lines. She did it automatically, the assessment preceding the conversation, the way it always preceded everything. "You're moving better than you should be at 8 hours post-op," she said. "I've had worse," he said. "You almost had nothing," she said. He held her gaze. His eyes were clearer than she expected, the particular clarity of someone who's teased but not masked, who had made a decision to be present rather than to retreat into the haze that was available to him if he wanted it. "I know," he said. "Solis told me. Solis talks a lot. He talks the right amount. He told me what you did." Vance paused. His chest rose and fell with the careful deliberateness of someone for whom breathing was currently a conscious activity. "He also told me he ran your background." "I know," he told me. "And in nothing. He ran it. It's his job." Vance looked at her for a long moment. "Lorac Valley," he said. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the Foley output. She looked at his blood pressure on the monitor, 96/60, still lower than she wanted but improving by the hour. "You need rest," she said. "I know who you are," he said. I've known since Solus read me the file, but I think I knew before that. Something about he stopped, swallowed carefully, the way people swallowed when their throat was sore. Something about the way you were standing over me when I was going in. I don't know how I registered it. I wasn't conscious. You weren't, but something registered. She said nothing. You were there, he said, on the ridge. You were part of the surgical team that night. She was quiet for 4 seconds. I was part of a team, she said. Yes. You were the one who... He stopped again. Whatever he was going to say, he reconsidered it. He looked at the ceiling. I lost 3 people that night, he said. I've spent 6 years thinking about the ones I lost. I don't spend enough time thinking about the ones who didn't. He looked back at her. Because of people like you. It was a team effort, she said. Stop saying that. She looked at him. I know it was a team, he said. I'm not saying it wasn't. I'm saying you were there, and what you did was... He ran out of words in the way that people ran out of words when the available vocabulary was insufficient for the actual experience. I looked for the surgical support team after. In the official record, there's almost nothing there. Names redacted. Actions summarized into 2 sentences. That's how those records work. I know how those records work. His voice tightened slightly. Not at her. At the fact. I know exactly how those records work, which is why I know that the 2 sentences don't come close to. He stopped. Why did you leave? She looked at the window. The morning was fully established outside the particular brightness of a Wyoming morning after a cold night, the kind of light that was very honest and didn't soften anything. That's a long conversation, she said. I have time. You have a ruptured renal vein repair and a blood pressure that's still 60 over where it should be. You don't have time for long conversations. He almost smiled. You sound like my mother. Your mother was probably right about most things. He was quiet for a moment. Will you come back? He asked. When I have time. She looked at him. Yes, she said. She meant it. She was aware, in the way she was aware of most things, that meaning it was complicated that Thomas Vance, knowing who she was, and her being his nurse, and the 6 men in the consultation room downstairs, knowing what Solus had pulled from her file, had already begun rearranging something that she had spent 6 years keeping carefully arranged. She had come to Harwick precisely because Harwick was the kind of place where nobody looked twice at a quiet night shift nurse who did her job without drawing attention. She had been good at maintaining that. She had been, until 11:43 the previous night, essentially invisible. She was not invisible anymore. Rest, she told him. She walked out of room 6 and down the SICXCU corridor and took the stairs to the first floor because she didn't want to wait for the elevator. In the main lobby, she stopped at the vending machine and bought a bottle of water and drank half of it standing there. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize, Doctor. Wolk has requested a meeting with hospital administration this morning. He's filed a report. Thought you should know. She looked at the message for a moment. She did not know who had sent it. She suspected it was Solus or someone connected to Solus's, which meant that Solus had resources inside Harwick that she had not accounted for, which was worth knowing. She also knew what a report from Wolk meant. She had been in that OR without assignment. She had scrubbed without being authorized. She had intervened in an active surgical case being managed by the attending physician of record. She had done all of those things, and she had done them because Thomas Vance would have died in the next 2 minutes if she hadn't, and the OR recording would show that clearly. But the OR recording would also show everything else. And Wolk was the attending of record, and she was a bedside nurse. And the hierarchy of a hospital was a real and functional structure, regardless of what happened inside any individual case. She finished the water. She knew what was coming. She had known it was coming from the moment she pushed those OR doors, the way she had known, before the ambulance bay doors opened, that the night was going to change. The knowing had never stopped her before. She threw the bottle in the recycling bin and walked toward the parking lot. She had gotten to her car and was reaching for her keys when she heard footsteps behind her. Quick, purposeful, and turned to find Marcus, the third-year resident, slightly out of breath from what looked like a jog from the hospital entrance. "Nurse Hale," he said. She waited. "I was in that OR last night." He stopped in front of her. He was 29, she estimated, with the particular look of someone who had been awake all night and was running on the kind of adrenaline that comes from having witnessed something that required recalibration of previously held assumptions. He stopped, started again. "I want you to know that I'm going to tell the truth. In whatever meeting they have, I'm going to say exactly what I saw." She looked at him. He met her gaze with the slightly unsteady intensity of someone making a decision they're not entirely sure they have the courage to follow through on, but have decided to commit to before the courage question becomes relevant. "You don't need to do that," she said. "I know I don't need to," he exhaled. "I want to. Because what Dr. Wolk filed this morning," he stopped again. His jaw tightened. "He's claiming he identified the posterior laceration. He's claiming he directed your actions." She looked at him. "He's claiming," Marcus said carefully, "that you were assisting him." The parking lot was quiet. A car pulled past them toward the exit. Somewhere across the lot, a truck engine turned over. Rebecca looked at the hospital entrance. She looked at the skyline above the building, the mountains visible at the edge of it. Snow-steeped in April, indifferent to everything happening at their base in the way that mountains were indifferent to everything happening at their base. She looked back at Marcus. "Go home and sleep," she said. "You've been on since yesterday afternoon. Nurse Hale." "Get some sleep, Marcus, and thank you." She got in her car. She sat for a moment before starting it. Harrison Wolk had filed a report. He had filed at some point this morning, in the window between the end of the surgery and whatever meeting he had requested with administration. And in that report, he had done something she had not anticipated, not because it was unimaginable, but because she had underestimated how quickly self-protective instinct could rewrite the record, even the record of events that had occurred in front of witnesses in a room with cameras. The OR had cameras. She knew that. She started the car. She pulled out of the parking space and drove toward the exit, and, as she passed the hospital entrance, she saw through the glass lobby doors the figure of Harrison Wolk walking toward the administrative wing, his back straight and his step carrying the particular weight of a man who believed he was walking toward a conversation he had already won. She watched him for 3 seconds through the glass. Then she drove out of the parking lot and toward home. She had not slept. She needed to sleep. And in 6 hours, when she was rested enough to think clearly, she was going to need to think very carefully about what she was going to do. Because Wolk had moved first, and first movers in administrative disputes had structural advantages that did not disappear just because the truth was available. And the truth, in this case, was in a room with cameras that she had not yet confirmed anyone had thought to secure. The cameras recorded to a server. Servers could be overwritten. She drove 3 blocks toward home before she pulled over, picked up her phone, and called the one person at Harwick she trusted without qualification. It rang twice. "Linda," Rebecca said when the charge nurse picked up. "The OR2 recording from last night. The server that holds it. Who has administrative access to that system?" A pause. "Why?" Linda asked. "Because Wolk filed a report this morning," Rebecca said, "and I need to know if that recording still exists." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that it was its own kind of answer. Linda Marsh had been the night charge nurse at Harwick for 14 years, which meant she had watched administrators come and go, had seen 3 chief surgeons cycle through, had worked through 2 joint commission audits and 1 malpractice suit that had settled quietly and been mentioned by nobody afterward. She was not a person who alarmed easily. She alarmed now. "The server," she said carefully, "is managed by the IT department. Access is restricted to 3 people: the IT director, the OR nursing manager, and the CMO." Wolk's meeting is with administration, Rebecca said. Is the CMO in that meeting? A pause. I don't know who's in the meeting. Can you find out? Another pause, longer. Rebecca could hear Linda breathing, could hear the particular quality of silence that meant someone was weighing the cost of a thing before agreeing to pay it. Give me 20 minutes, Linda said, and hung up. Rebecca sat in her parked car on a residential street 4 blocks from the hospital and looked at the steering wheel. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of Wyoming April morning that looked like summer through glass and felt like February the moment you stepped outside. A dog barked somewhere down the block. A sprinkler ran in someone's yard, absurd in the cold. She did not drive home. She sat, and what she thought about was not Wolk, or the recording, or the administrative meeting. She thought about the renal vein, the specific texture of it under fingertips in the OR, the way the tear had communicated itself to her through pressure and flow before she could see it, the way the clamp had seated and the hemorrhage had slowed and the monitor had held at 48/26 for those 4 seconds before the anesthesiologist confirmed it aloud. She thought about whether she had done it correctly, because correct was not the same as successful, and she had always understood that, and she ran through the sequence again in the manner of someone conducting an internal review, not for legal protection, but because getting it right mattered independently of what happened to her as a result of having done it. The clamp placement had been correct. The decision to scrub had been correct. The decision to enter the OR in the first place had been a decision she had made with full understanding of what it would cost her, and she had made it because the alternative was standing outside the door while Thomas Vance bled to death 12 feet away. She was at peace with the decision. She was not at peace with Wolk rewriting it. Her phone rang. Linda. CMO is not in the meeting, Linda said. The meeting is Wolk, the VP of Medical Affairs, and the Risk Management Director. HR may be dialing in. Who called the meeting? Wolk requested it at 6:45 this morning. He submitted a written incident report first. Do you know what the report says? Not word for word. Linda's voice was careful, measured. She was giving Rebecca information she was not technically authorized to share, and she knew it, and she was doing it anyway, and the fact that she was doing it anyway said something about both of them. But the nursing manager told me it alleges unauthorized entry into a restricted sterile environment, unsolicited interference in an active surgical procedure, and, Rebecca, he's claiming patient endangerment. Patient endangerment. She repeated the phrase internally. Turned it over. Wolk had filed a report in which the nurse who had controlled the hemorrhage he caused was the person who had endangered the patient. It was not a legally absurd position, which was what made it dangerous. She had entered the OR without assignment. She had scrubbed without authorization. She had placed her hands in a surgical cavity during a procedure being managed by a credentialed attending physician. Each of those facts was true. Each of them was documented. The context in which they occurred was also documented on a server that 3 people had administrative access to, one of whom was now in a meeting with the risk management director. The OR recording, Rebecca said. Has anyone pulled it? Not that I've heard. Someone needs to pull it before that meeting ends. Rebecca, Linda, if that recording gets flagged as evidence in an administrative proceeding before it gets reviewed independently, it goes into a chain of custody that Wolk's team can influence. It needs to be reviewed first by someone who isn't connected to him. A long silence. I can ask your nursing manager, Linda said. She's not in the meeting. She has access to the server as a secondary administrator. Is she someone Wolk can reach? The silence told her the answer was complicated. She's not his friend, Linda said finally, but she's cautious. She's going to want to know why I'm asking her to pull a recording outside of the standard incident review process. Tell her a nurse is being accused of patient endangerment for an intervention that kept the patient alive. Rebecca said, Psych, tell her to watch the last 20 minutes of that recording. That's all she needs to see. She heard Linda exhale. Go home, Linda said. Sleep, I'll call you. Rebecca started the car. She slept 4 hours, which was not enough, but was what her body would accept, before it stopped cooperating. She woke at noon with the particular alertness of someone whose nervous system had decided that sleep was finished, regardless of what the rest of her thought about it, and lay in the dark of her bedroom with her eyes open for 3 minutes, running through everything she knew. What she knew was this: Wolk had filed first, which gave him narrative priority in the administrative process. The recording existed and would corroborate her account if it was reviewed by someone objective, but its review was not guaranteed and its existence was not permanent. Marcus had witnessed everything and had said he would speak. But Marcus was a third-year resident whose career was functionally controlled by the attending physicians at Harwick. And the courage people felt at 7 in the morning in a parking lot sometimes underwent revision by afternoon. Ferris had been in the OR during the repair and had seen the field and had assessed her clamp placement, but Ferris had not been present for the sequence that preceded it. The moment Wolk froze, the moment Rebecca entered, the critical 90 seconds. Ferris was a careful woman who would give an accurate account what she had seen without volunteering what she hadn't. Solis knew, Vance knew, but they were not employees of Harwick, and their knowledge existed in a domain that did not overlap cleanly with the administrative process of a regional hospital. She got up, made coffee, and called Linda. The OR nursing manager pulled the recording, Linda said, before Rebecca could speak. She watched it, all of it. Rebecca waited. She didn't say much to me. But she left her office about 10 minutes ago and walked into the VP's meeting. Rebecca set her coffee down. The meeting that's still going? The meeting that started at 9 and has now been going for 3 hours, Linda said, which is not a normal length for a complaint intake meeting. Something shifted in the administrative calculus. A 3-hour meeting meant the complaint was not being processed quickly. Quick processing was what happened when the outcome was already determined. 3 hours meant someone in that room was pushing back against a conclusion that someone else had arrived at before sitting down. Do you know what she showed them? Rebecca asked. No. But Linda stopped. Wolk came out of the meeting 20 minutes ago. He walked to his office. He hasn't come back out. She understood what that meant. A surgeon who walked out of a meeting and did not return was a surgeon who had received information that required reconsideration. Reconsideration took time. Time was spent privately, not at a conference table. Thank you, Rebecca said. Don't thank me yet, Linda said. The VP's office called the nursing supervisors this morning, before the recording was pulled. They asked about your credentialing file, your scope of practice documentation. Of course they had. Wolk's report would have framed the intervention as a scope of practice violation, because that was the cleanest legal angle a nurse operating outside her defined clinical boundaries, regardless of outcome. Outcome was medically relevant, but legally secondary to scope. She could have saved the patient 10 times over, and it would not change the fact that she had placed a vascular clamp in an open surgical cavity, which was not a defined nursing action under any credentialing framework at Harwick Regional Medical Center. Is there anything in my file that's a problem? She asked, because she needed to hear it stated rather than assumed. Your Wyoming nursing license is current. Your BLS and ACLS are current. You have a trauma certification that was renewed last year. Linda paused. You don't have surgical scrub privileges. You're not credentialed as a surgical nurse at Harwick. No, Rebecca said, I'm not, which is what Wolk's report is built on. I know. She hung up and sat at her kitchen table with her coffee going cold and thought about the gap in her credentialing file, the gap that was real and accurate, and that Wolk's legal strategy was correctly identifying. She thought about the 7 years that Solis had described as institutional, the deployments, the forward surgical elements, the mass casualty events, where the distinction between nursing actions and surgical actions had been a bureaucratic necrosis that the environment did not recognize and that the outcomes did not reward. She thought about the training she had received during those years, the procedures she had performed, the certifications that existed in a document that were classified above the administrative level of a Wyoming regional hospital. None of that was in her Harwick file. None of it was legally applicable to her civilian nursing practice. She had known that. When she entered the OR, she had entered anyway. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she now recognized as Solace. "We need to talk. Not by phone. Can you come back to the hospital?" She looked at the message. Then she got up, poured the cold coffee down the sink, and got her keys. Solace was waiting in the hospital's east parking structure, third level, away from the main entrance cameras. She noticed the camera positioning before she noticed him, which was habit rather than paranoia, and the fact that he had chosen a location that minimized recording was information about how he was thinking about the situation. He was leaning against a support column with his arms crossed, and when she pulled in and got out of the car, he straightened and walked toward her without preliminary. "Wolk's report was submitted to the state nursing board this morning," he said. "Not just to hospital administration, to the board." She absorbed that. A hospital administrative complaint was containable. A state nursing board filing was not. The board operated independently of Harwick, had its own investigation process, and had the authority to suspend or revoke a nursing license, regardless of what any hospital administration decided internally. The two processes would run in parallel, and a board investigation would take months, and during those months, her license could be restricted pending outcome, which meant she could not work. "He filed it before the administrative meeting?" she asked. "Time-stamped at 6:52 a.m., Solis said. Meeting started at 9. He filed with the board first, and then went into the meeting, which meant Wolk had not filed the board complaint because of anything that happened in the administrative meeting. He had filed it before the meeting because he intended to use the board filing as leverage in the meeting, a signal that the situation had already escalated beyond hospital-level resolution, that the consequences for Rebecca existed in a domain that hospital administration could not contain even if they wanted to. It was a sophisticated move. She had underestimated him. "He's trying to force a settlement," she said. "If the board investigation opens, Harwick's risk management will want to close their internal review quickly to avoid parallel liability exposure. Quick closure means they accept his version." "That's my read," Solis said. "And the recording?" The OR nursing manager brought it into the meeting. "I have a contact inside who says Wolk's account doesn't match what's on it. But the risk manager is arguing that the recording documents a scope violation regardless of the clinical context." He paused. "He's not wrong about the scope violation, Rebecca." She looked at him. "I know," she said. He held her gaze. "What I want to know is whether you have documentation of your training, not your Harwick file. The other training." She was quiet for a moment. A car moved through the parking structure below them, its engine echoing off the concrete. "Some of it is classified," she said. "Some of it. Some of it isn't." She thought about the certifications, the advanced trauma life support, the tactical combat casualty care instructor certification, the vascular hemorrhage control course she had completed during her second deployment under the military's extended battlefield care program. Those existed in records that were not classified. They were military training records, accessible through proper request channels, documented in a system that was separate from her civilian file, but not sealed. "There are training records from my military service that are not classified. Certifications, course completions. They document procedures I was trained to perform under physician supervision in austere environments, including vascular clamp placement, including hemorrhage control procedures that encompass vascular clamp placement under physician oversight." She paused. Ferris was in that OR. She supervised the placement. She assessed it and deemed it correct. The question is whether her presence constitutes the physician oversight component. Solis was quiet for a moment, working through it. That's not nothing, he said. It's not sufficient on its own, she said, but it changes the framing. The board complaint is built on the premise that I acted alone, outside any supervisory framework. If the record shows that a credentialed vascular surgeon was present, assessed my action, and continued the case under her authority, the characterization of my actions as unauthorized becomes more complicated. Will Ferris say that? She thought about Ferris, the economy of her movements, the two words she had offered over the surgical field. Good placement. The way she had said, stay scrubbed, rather than sending Rebecca out of the room. I don't know, she said honestly. Ferris will tell the truth. Whether the truth serves me depends on how the truth is framed and who's asking the questions. Solis nodded slowly. Vance wants to make a statement, he said. A statement about what? He was unconscious. He's the patient. He has standing to make a statement about his own care. And his statement would establish that the military liaison unit requested the highest available level of trauma intervention, that they were present and did not object to your involvement, and that the outcome. He stopped. His statement won't fix the scope question, but it will complicate the narrative that you endangered him. She leaned against her car and crossed her arms. She leaned to the car and crossed her arms and looked at the concrete ceiling of the parking structure. She had spent 6 years being invisible at Harwick. She had structured her life around that invisibility, Dechotstedt, the night shifts, the quiet competence, the deliberate absence of the kind of professional ambition that made people look at you. She had come to Wyoming, because Wyoming was far from the places where people knew her name, and Harwick was the kind of facility where a skilled nurse who did good work and kept her down could exist without drawing the kind of attention that required explanation she had decided she was finished giving. All of that was over. It had ended when she pushed through the OR door. She had known it would end. She had made the decision anyway. Tell Vance I'll come back this afternoon, she said. And Solis, she looked at him, the board filing. If Wolk submitted it this morning, the board has it now. They'll send a notice to my license address within 48 hours. I need to have documentation ready before that notice arrives. Your military training records, and anything from Ferris, if she's willing. Solis was already reaching for his phone. I know someone in military records processing. Expedited request is possible given the circumstances. He looked up. It'll take 24 hours minimum. Then we have 24 hours, she said. She got back in her car. She drove to the hospital, not because she had been asked to, but because Vance's afternoon check-in was reasonable, and because she needed to see the SCU with her own eyes, needed to look at his numbers, his color, his urine output, the things that told her whether last night's work had held. She signed in as a visitor because her nursing access to the SICU was technically unaffected by the administrative complaint until a formal suspension was issued. She was aware of the technical precision of that position and the fact that walking into the SICU under visitor stat rather than staff status was a choice that would be noted and potentially used, and she made the choice anyway because Thomas Vance's renal vein repair was 17 hours old, and she was not going to stop being a nurse because Harrison Wolk had filed paperwork. She stopped at the SICU nursing station first. The charge nurse was a man named Devin, who had worked the unit for 3 years and who gave Rebecca the kind of look that meant he had heard something and was deciding how much of what he had heard to factor into his interaction with her. His pressure is up to 106 over 68, Devin said, without being asked. Urine output has been consistent since 5 a.m. Hemoglobin this morning was 8.2, which is low but trending. He paused. He's been asking about you since he woke up. I heard, she said. She went to room 6. Vance looked better than he had at 8 in the morning, which was not saying much, but was saying something. His color had moved from gray toward a more neutral pallor. He was sitting up at a 45-degree angle, which required core engagement that she knew was costing him more than his expression showed. Because men like Thomas Vance had a specific and long-trained relationship with not showing what things cost them. "You came back," he said. "I said I would." She checked his lines, dressing his monitors automatically, without asking permission, the way nurses moved through rooms that contained patients in their care. He watched her do it without comment, which meant he either understood the language of it or had enough experience with medical environments to know when to get out of the way. "Solis told me about the board filing," he said. She looked at his wound drain output. "Acceptable. Solis tells you a lot. It's his job to keep me informed." Vance shifted slightly and controlled the response to the movement with the particular facial economy she was already recognizing as characteristic. "What he told me made me angry. That's not useful to either of us right now." "I know." He didn't sound apologetic about it. "I want to make a statement. To the board, to the hospital, to whoever needs to hear it." "I know you do," Solis told me. "Will it help?" She straightened. She looked at him directly. "It will help establish that I didn't endanger you. It won't resolve the scope question. Those are two different problems, and Wolk's filing conflates them deliberately." She paused. "Your statement matters for one of them. The other one I have to solve differently." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" "I need Ferris to go on record about what she observed in the OR. Specifically, about her assessment of the clamp placement and her decision to retain me as scrubbed support rather than removing me." "Will she?" "I don't know yet. I can request to speak with her," he said. "As the patient. I have standing to ask questions about my own procedure." "That's true," she said carefully. "But it can't look like pressure. If Ferris thinks she's being pushed toward a statement, she'll pull back. She's a precise person. She'll give what she observed and nothing more, and that's actually what I need from her, what she observed. And nothing more, stated precisely, in a context where the framing is neutral. How do you get that without asking for it?" "I ask for it," she said. "Just not through you." He looked at her for a long moment. "You have a plan." "I have the beginning of a plan," she said. "Plans need more information than I currently have to be actual plans." "What information are you missing?" She hesitated. It was a genuine hesitation, not a performance of it. She was deciding how much of her current calculation to share with a man who was 17 hours post-operative and whose body needed the energy it was currently spending on following her thinking. "I need to know what's on the recording," she said. "Not what the OR nursing manager described to the VP. The actual footage. Wolk's report claims he identified the laceration and directed my actions. The recording will show whether that's true, but I haven't seen it, and I need to see it before I understand what I'm actually working with." Vance said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Solis can get it." She looked at him. "The hospital server," Vance said. "The recording. If there's a question of evidence integrity." "The recording is hospital property," she said. "If Solis extracts it outside of the formal review process, it contaminates the chain of custody. It becomes inadmissible, and it becomes a second incident. He doesn't have to extract it. He has to make sure it's preserved." Vance met her eyes. "There's a difference between taking a copy and ensuring the original isn't altered." She thought about that. The distinction was real. It was also finer than she was comfortable navigating at 17 hours post-event with an administrative complaint already filed. "Tell him to check on preservation," she said. "Nothing more." Vance nodded. He reached for his phone on the bedside table, typed something short, and set it down. "Done," he said. Then his monitor alarmed. Not dramatically, not the flat, continuous alarm of cardiac arrest, not the cascading alerts of a pressure crash. A single, distinct, high-pitched tone that Rebecca's nervous system processed before her conscious mind did, and she was already at the monitor when she read the number. Heart rate 138. Irregular. She looked at the waveform. Narrow, complex, irregular rhythm, rate climbing. Not the rate of pain or anxiety or a patient who had just reached for his phone. atrial fibrillation. New onset, post-surgical, not uncommon after major abdominal procedures, and significant blood loss and a body that had been running a cardiovascular deficit for 14 hours, but not benign. Not in a patient whose pressure was 106/68 and whose hemoglobin was 8.2, and who still had a repaired venous laceration that had not been tested under the hemodynamic stress that AFib-driven tachycardia was now about to apply to it. She hit the call button. "I need Devin in room 6 right now," she said before anyone spoke. "New onset AFib, rate 138. Get the intensivist." She looked at Vance. His color had shifted not dramatically, but the pallor had deepened slightly at the edges. "Lay back," she said. "What's happening?" "Your heart is doing something it shouldn't. It's manageable, but you need to lay back and stop doing anything that requires effort." He lowered the head of his bed without argument, which told her he felt it, the flutter, the irregularity, the sense of a rhythm that wasn't quite locking into itself properly. "Breathe normally," she said. "Not deep. Normal." Devin came in with the intensivist 30 seconds behind him, and Rebecca stepped to the side to give them space while staying close enough to the monitor to track the rate. The intensivist was a woman named Dr. Priya Sandhu, who looked at the waveform, looked at Rebecca, and said, "What's his potassium from this morning?" 3.4, Rebecca said from memory. Sandhu ordered magnesium and a repeat metabolic panel and started talking about rhythm conversion options if the rate didn't respond, and the room compressed around the immediate clinical problem the way rooms did when something new and urgent arrived to push everything else to the periphery. Rebecca stood at the edge of it and watched Vance's face. He was looking at the ceiling, breathing carefully, his jaw slightly set, with the effort of not fighting a body that was currently doing something without his consent. He was not scared, or rather, if he was scared, the fear was filed somewhere below the threshold of his expression. Managed with the same economy he applied to everything else his body presented him with, against his preferences. He turned his head and found her eyes across the room. She held his gaze for a moment. Then her phone vibrated in her pocket. She stepped into the corridor and looked at it. A text from Linda. "The VP's meeting ended an hour ago. Administrative suspension, pending investigation, effective immediately. Security has been notified to restrict your badge access." "Rebecca, there's something else." Wolk requested the OR recording be placed under administrative hold this morning, before the nursing manager pulled it. The hold request was approved by the CMO's office at 7:15 a.m. She read it twice. The CMO's office had approved the hold at 7:15 a.m. The nursing manager had pulled the recording to show the VP at some point after 9, which meant that between 7:15 and whenever the nursing manager had accessed the server, someone with CMO-level administrative authority had placed a hold on that recording, a hold that could restrict viewing, duplication, or external release pending review. And the CMO's office had done that at Wolk's request. An hour and 23 minutes before the meeting that was supposed to review the evidence. She stood in the SEQ corridor with her phone in her hand and her badge access already restricted on a server somewhere in the building, and Thomas Vance in new onset AFib in the room behind her. And she understood with complete clarity that Wolk had not made a tactical mistake by filing first. He had made a tactical move, and the CMO had already answered it. Her phone buzzed again. Solis this time. One line. The recording server. It's been accessed twice since 6 a.m. The second access was at 7:12, 3 minutes before the CMO approved the hold. Footage from OR2 last night, the timestamp segment, covering 10:50 p.m. to 1:15 a.m. It's been marked for archival compression. Rebecca, compression at that resolution destroys 90% of the detail. Someone started the compression process at 7:12 a.m., and if nobody stops it, it completes in 4 hours. She looked at the time on her phone. It was 1:47 p.m. 4 hours from 7:12 a.m. was 11:12 a.m. which had passed 2 hours and 35 minutes ago. She read Solis's text a second time. Not because she had misunderstood it the first time, because the mind did that reached for a second pass, when the first pass delivered something it needed a moment to accept. The compression had completed 2 hours and 35 minutes ago. She stood in the SICU corridor and ran the math again, cleanly, without hope distorting it. The process had started at 7. 12. It completed in 4 hours. That put completion at 11:12 a.m. She was reading this at 1:47 p.m. The window had been closed for over 2 hours before Solis had even discovered it existed. Her first response was not panic. It was something colder and more operational, the rapid triage of remaining assets. The same process she applied to a trauma bay when one intervention failed, and the situation required immediate recalculation without the luxury of processing what had just been lost. The recording was gone, or as close to gone, as made no functional difference. What remained? Marcus, his account of what he had witnessed. Ferris, her assessment of the clamp placement, and her decision to retain Rebecca as scrubbed support. Devon and the SICU staff, who had received a patient who was alive when by any clinical metric he should not have been. The anesthesiologist from OR2, a man named Dr. Phil Garrett, who had been at the head of the table for the entire sequence and whose memory of the event was both accurate and specific. And the fragment itself in a specimen container in the hospital pathology lab with chain of custody documentation that Solis had confirmed was intact. The fragment whose oblique axis Rebecca had flagged before the surgery. The fragment that had migrated exactly as she had warned it might, and torn the vessel exactly as she had warned it might, and whose retrieval from a posterior vascular position, rather than the lateral splenic position Wolk had identified on CT, would tell its own story to anyone who understood anatomy well enough to read it. The recording was gone. The evidence was not. She typed back to Solis, archived or overwritten. His response took 90 seconds, compressed to low-resolution archive. Original file structures exists, but detail is degraded. Usable for timestamp confirmation, not for clinical assessment of actions. She read that twice, too. Then she went back into room 6. Vance's rate had come down to 104 with the magnesium, and he was no longer in frank fibrillation. The rhythm had inverted to sinus tachycardias, but was not ideal, but was substantially better than where it had been 8 minutes ago. Sandhu was adjusting his beta blocker dose and explaining the plan in the direct, unembellished language that Vance clearly preferred, and that Sandhu, to her credit, had assessed and calibrated to within the first 30 seconds of meeting him. Rebecca waited until Sandhu had finished and moved to the doorway. "Dr. Sandhu," she said, "can I speak with you for a moment?" Sandhu came into the corridor and looked at Rebecca with an expression that was professionally neutral in a way that told Rebecca she already knew about the administrative suspension. News in hospitals did not travel slowly. "The AFib episode," Rebecca said. "His magnesium was low this morning. The 3.4 potassium suggested it. Did anyone order a mag level on admission to the SICU?" Sandhu looked at her carefully. "No," she said, "it wasn't ordered. It should have been, given the blood loss volume and the duration of surgery." She paused. "I'm not saying that as a critique of the SICU team. I'm saying it because if his rhythm destabilizes again tonight, magnesium repletion history is going to matter." Sandhu was quiet for a moment. She was not a woman who responded quickly to things she processed visibly, which Rebecca had come to read as a sign of rigor rather than hesitation. "I'll add serial mag levels to his monitoring orders," Sandhu said, "and I'll note the clinical flag in his record." Another pause. "Rebecca, I heard about the board filing. I want you to know that what I observed when I came into that room this morning." She stopped. "If anyone asks me, I'll tell them what I observed." "What did you observe?" "A patient in new onset AFib, whose nurse was already at the monitor before the alarm had finished sounding." She held Rebecca's gaze for a moment. and who knew his morning labs from memory. She went back into the room. Rebecca stood in the corridor and allowed herself exactly 4 seconds of something that was not quite relief, more like the acknowledgement that not everything was lost, which was a different and more durable thing than relief. Then she called. Ferris answered on the second rings. Ferris answered on the second ring, which meant she had seen the number and decided to pick up, which meant something. "Rebecca," she said. "Dr. Ferris, I need to ask you something directly. I assumed that's why you were calling. In OR 2 last night, after you arrived when you assessed the clamp placement, you said 2 words. Good placement. And then you told me to stay scrubbed." A silence. "Yes," Ferris said. "If you're asked to give an account of that decision, the decision to retain me as scrubbed support rather than removing me, would you characterize your presence as constituting physician oversight of my actions during the repair?" The silence this time was longer. Rebecca did not fill it. "That's a specific legal framing," Ferris said. "Yes, it is. You're asking me whether my staying in that OR with you constitutes supervision under the scope of practice framework. I'm asking you what you would say if asked that question by the nursing board." Another silence. "I would say," Ferris said slowly, "that I entered OR 2, assessed the field, assessed the patient's status, evaluated the clamp placement as technically sound, and made an active decision to proceed with the repair with you as scrubbed support rather than replacing you. I would say that I was present and clinically responsible for the case from the moment I entered the room." She paused. "I would also say that the alternative removing an experienced practitioner who had achieved proximal and distal control on a hemorrhaging renal vein while the patient's pressure was 48/26 would have been a clinical decision I was not willing to make." Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Ferris said. "It's what happened. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm telling the truth. A beat." "But Rebecca, the recording." "I know. I heard it was compressed." "Yes. That's going to make everything harder." Ferris was quiet for a moment. "I've worked with Wolk for 2 years. He's a good surgeon who makes better decisions when he isn't threatened. Last night, he was threatened from the moment that patient arrived, and he spent the rest of the night making decisions from that position." She stopped. "What he put in that report is not what happened. I know that, and I'll say so." After she hung up, Rebecca sat in her car in the hospital parking structure for 11 minutes, building the architecture of what she had. Ferris's account, Marcus's account, Garrett, the anesthesiologist, who she hadn't contacted yet but whose memory of the sequence was precise, and whose position at the head of the table had given him an unobstructed view of everything. The fragment's location in pathology, which told the story of where it had actually been versus where Wolk had said it was. Sandhu's observation this morning. The paramedic Carla's documentation from the field, which would show the 2 saturation zones on the dressing that Rebecca had flagged before anyone went to CT. None of it was the recording. All of it was real. She called the attorney for referral line for the State Nurses Association because she was a member, and because this was exactly the situation the membership existed to address, and because going into a board investigation without legal representation was not a mistake she was willing to make, regardless of how confident she was in the truth of her account. The referral connected her to a woman named Janet Okafor, a healthcare attorney in Cheyenne, who had 17 years of nursing board defense and whose voice on the phone was the particular combination of precise and unhurried that told Rebecca she was someone who had sat across from institutional power, enough times to have stopped being impressed by it. Rebecca explained the situation without editorializing. Facts, sequence, documentation status. Okafor listened without interrupting. "The recording compression," Okafor said, when Rebecca finished. "What time was the hold request submitted relative to the compression initiation?" "Hold request approved at 7:15. Compression initiated at 7:12. 3 minutes before the hold was approved." "Yes." "Which means the compression was initiated before the CMO had formally authorized the hold, which means whoever initiated it did so without the administrative authorization that the hold was meant to provide. A pause. That's not a small thing, Rebecca. She had not thought about it from that angle. She had been focused on the loss of the recording. She had not considered the sequence of the actions that led to its degradation. The IT access logs, Okafor said. Every server access is logged. Who accessed the OR recording server at 7:12? I don't know. I need those logs. If the compression was initiated before the administrative hold was approved, the person who initiated it was acting outside of any authorized process. That's not evidence management. That's evidence tampering. The word landed in the parking structure, like something physical. Evidence tampering was not an administrative complaint. It was not a scope of practice dispute. It was a different category of problem, entirely the kind that moved from hospital administration to legal counsel to, in serious cases, law enforcement. Can you get the logs? Okafor asked. Not directly. My badge access has been suspended. Solus, Rebecca said. Not to Okafor to herself. I'm sorry? I have a contact who may be able to get them through a different channel. Get them, Okafor said, and don't share them with anyone except me until I've reviewed them. If what the sequence suggests is accurate, those logs are the most important piece of evidence in this case. Another pause. One more thing. Wolk's operative report, the one he filed, as part of the surgical record, not the complaint. Do you know what it says? I was told he claimed to have identified the vascular laceration and directed my actions. The operative report is a legal document. If he made false statements in it, that's a separate issue from the complaint against you. That's falsification of medical records. Okafor's voice was even. I want a copy of that report. I don't have access to the medical record system. My badge Vance is the patient, Okafor said. He has the right to request his own medical records. All of them, including the operative note, and he can share those records with whomever he chooses for the purpose of understanding his own care. Solus took 40 minutes to get the IT access logs, which was faster than Rebecca had expected, and spoke to resources she had decided not to ask about directly. He sent them to Okafor's secure email and forwarded a copy to Rebecca with a message that contained 3 words. Look at the name. She looked at the name. The 712 access, the compression initiation, was logged under a user credential that did not belong to IT staff. It did not belong to the OR nursing manager. It did not belong to anyone in administration. It was logged under the credential of Dr. Harrison Wolk. Wolk had personally accessed the OR server at 7:12 a.m. and initiated the compression process on the OR2 recording from the previous night. He had done it 3 minutes before the CMO's office approved the administrative hold that he had requested for the hold that was supposed to provide the institutional authorization for any action taken regarding that recording. He had not waited for authorization. He had acted first, then sought cover. The pattern was familiar. It was exactly what he had done with the Operative Report Act, then construct a record that made the action appear defensible. The difference was that the operative report was his own document, and the IT access logs were the hospital's, and the hospital's logs did not care about his version of events. She forwarded the logs to Okafor and then sat in the parking structure and breathed. This was not over. She understood that. The board investigation was open and would proceed on its own timeline, regardless of what happened with the IT logs. Her suspension was in effect. Her badge access was restricted. She was not at this moment a nurse, in good standing at Harwick Regional Medical Center. But the ground had shifted. She called Solus. He accessed the server himself, she said. I saw. He initiated the compression under his own credential, before the hold was approved. I know. Solus's voice was careful. Not surprised he had sent her the logs. He had read them first. But careful in the way of someone who was holding something larger than the immediate situation and working out how to carry it. Rebecca. Vance got his operative note this afternoon. As a patient records request, she waited. Wolk's operative report states that he identified the posterior venous laceration during mobilization of the spleen, achieved initial hemostasis with direct pressure, and directed the assisting nurse's placement of the vascular clamp under his supervision. Solis paused. He wrote himself as the primary operative decision-maker from the point of hemorrhage control forward. She had known it was coming. She had been told it was coming. Knowing and hearing the specific language were different things. Ferris was the attending on record from the point she entered the OR, Rebecca said. Wolk's claim that he was directing the repair while Ferris was standing at the table contradicts Ferris's account, Solis said, and Ferris is a co-author on that operative note as the vascular surgeon of record. Her signature is on it. Did she sign it as written? She signed the vascular repair section. The hemorrhage control narrative before her section, that's Wolk's authorship. He wrote it before she reviewed it, and the system timestamped her signature on the full document, which meant Ferris had signed a document that contained language she had not authored and might not have read carefully enough to catch. It was not an uncommon problem. In operative documentation complex, multi-surgeon cases generated notes that were assembled from individual sections, and surgeons signed off on their own portions with the understanding that other sections reflected the other surgeon's accounts. Ferris might not know what Wolk had written above her signature. Someone needs to tell her, Rebecca said. That's a conversation that needs to happen in person, Solis said. Not by phone. She checked the time. 4:18 p.m. Ferris's OR schedule ran until 5 on most days. I'll go to the hospital, she said. Your badge is suspended. I'm a visitor. I signed in as a visitor this morning. Visitor access isn't restricted. Rebecca. His voice changed slightly. Wolk is still in the building. He's been in and out of the administrative wing all afternoon. If he sees you. He's going to see me eventually, she said. I'd rather it be on my timeline than his. She got out of the car. She found Ferris in the surgeon's lounge on the second floor, still in scrubs, eating something from a vending machine with the focused efficiency of a person eating because the body requires fuel rather than because the food is enjoyable. Ferris looked up when Rebecca came in. Eric's section and her expression moved through quickly before settling into something composed and attentive. Sit down, Ferris said. Rebecca sat. She showed Ferris the relevant section of Wolk's operative note on her phone, the paragraph that described the hemorrhage control sequence, the language that placed Wolk as the directing authority, and Rebecca as executing his instructions. Ferris read it. She read it twice, and Rebecca watched her face while she read, watching for the response that would tell her whether Ferris had known and signed it anyway or had not known and was encountering it now for the first time. It was the second one. She was certain of it. Ferris set the phone down on the table between them. She placed it carefully, precisely, the way she placed instruments. She looked at it for a moment after she set it down, as though she needed to look at something other than Rebecca's face while she decided what to say. He wrote that before I reviewed the document, she said. Yes. My signature covers the full operative note. Yes. Ferris was quiet for a long moment. Her jaw tightened fractionally, not anger exactly, more the specific expression of someone whose precision has been used against them. She was a woman who relied on accuracy, who signed her name to documents because she trusted that what they said was true, and the document she had signed did not say what was true. I need to submit an addendum, she said. Operative note addendums require attending authorization and are flagged in the system, Rebecca said. If you submit one now, Wolk's team will know immediately. I know that. Ferris met her eyes. I'm going to submit it anyway. What he wrote is not what happened. My name is on that note. I'm not leaving inaccurate documentation under my signature because the timing is inconvenient. Rebecca looked at her. There's something else, Rebecca said. The T-access logs. Wolk accessed the OR recording server at 7:12 this morning under his own credential. He initiated the compression. 3 minutes before the administrative hold was approved. Ferris was still for a moment. He destroyed the recording, she said. Degraded it. The file structure exists, but the clinical detail is gone. Ferris picked up her phone. She made a call, and when someone answered, she said, "This is Dr. Ferris. I need to speak with the CMO. Tonight's not a request." She hung up and looked at Rebecca. "I want you to understand something," she said. Her voice was even, direct, entirely without drama. "I didn't know you before last night. I don't have a reason to protect you. That isn't purely clinical. What I'm doing because that operative note has my signature on it, and it contains statements that are false, and the recording that would have clarified the truth was altered by the person who wrote those statements under my name." She paused. "That's not a nursing problem or a scope problem. That's a documentation integrity problem. And that's mine to address." Rebecca nodded. "I know," she said. Ferris stood. She picked up the remnant of her vending machine food, looked at it briefly, and dropped it in the trash with the expression of someone completing an item on a list. "Go home," she said. "Let your attorney handle what happens next." Rebecca stood, too. She was almost to the door when she heard the sound from the corridor, the particular tone of raised voices, not yelling but elevated, the kind of sound that moved through a hospital corridor differently from normal conversation. She stopped. Ferris was already at the door. In the corridor outside the surgeon's lounge, Wolk was speaking to a man Rebecca did not recognize suited, carrying a leather portfolio, the particular aspect of someone from outside the hospital's daily operations. A risk management consultant, she thought, or legal counsel. Wolk's voice was controlled but pressured, the voice of someone who believed he was handling a situation and was encountering the first resistance to that belief. Then Wolk looked up and saw Rebecca standing in the doorway. He stopped speaking. The silence between them lasted approximately 3 seconds. She did not look away. Neither did he. In those 3 seconds, she watched something move through his expression. Not guilt, not fear, not anything that simple. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who had spent the past 10 hours constructing a narrative and had just seen, in the face of the person that narrative was designed to bury, that the construction was not as complete as he had believed. He turned back to the man beside him and said something, quietly. The man with the portfolio looked at Rebecca. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened his portfolio, removed a document, and held it out toward her. She crossed the corridor and took it. It was a formal notice from Harwick Regional Medical Center's legal office. It informed her that her nursing privileges at Harwick were suspended pending the outcome of the board investigation, that she was required to vacate hospital premises, and that any further presence in the facility as a non-visitor would constitute trespassing under Wyoming statute. She read it, she folded it, she put it in her pocket. She looked at Wolk. "Dr. Wolk," she said, quietly, without heat. "The IT access logs from the OR server this morning have been provided to my attorney. The timestamps are very specific. His expression did not change. But the man with the portfolio looked at him with the particular sharpness of an attorney who has just heard something he was not briefed on. "What logs?" the man said to Wolk. Wolk did not answer immediately. And in the half-second of his silence, something shifted in the corridor, something in the alignment between Wolk and the man beside him, a subtle reconfiguration of whose side of the table each of them was standing on. "Harrison," the man said. "What logs is she talking about?" Wolk answered his attorney's question the way men answered questions when they had not prepared for the question to be asked in that specific location, in that specific company, with that specific witness standing 6 feet away. He answered it poorly. "The request was placed under administrative hold," he said. "Standard procedure for incident review. The compression was initiated at 7:12, Rebecca said. The hold was approved at 7:15, 3 minutes after the compression started. Under your credential, The attorney, whose name she did not know and did not need to know, looked at Wolk with the expression of a man doing rapid arithmetic on a problem he had not been given all the variables for. The arithmetic was not producing a comfortable result. Harrison, the attorney's voice had changed. Flatter. More careful. I need you to not say anything else right now. Wolk looked at him. I mean that, the attorney said. Ferris was standing in the surgeon's lounge doorway. She had not moved since the exchange began. She looked at Rebecca once briefly, and then looked at Wolk with the particular stillness of someone who has decided something and is waiting for the appropriate moment to act on it. Rebecca folded the trespass notice she was still holding and put it in her jacket pocket. I'll see myself out, she said. She walked down the corridor toward the elevator. She did not look back. She heard the attorney's voice drop into something low and rapid, and directed entirely at Wolk, the sound of legal counsel beginning the process of understanding exactly how much trouble their client had created, and whether any of it was salvageable. She pressed the elevator button. She wrote it down alone. She walked through the main lobby, past the vending machines, and past the vending evening, which was automatic doors into the April evening, which was cold and clear and indifferent to everything that had happened inside the building behind her, the way evenings were indifferent to the buildings they surrounded. She got in her car. She sat for 2 minutes. Then she drove home and went to sleep. What happened next happened without her, which was how it was supposed to work. She had spent 6 years believing that the only way to ensure an outcome was to be present for every step of it, and the previous 24 hours had demonstrated that this belief was not always accurate, that sometimes the most effective thing she could do was hand evidence to people whose job it was to act on evidence and then get out of the way. Okafor filed a formal response to the board complaint within 48 hours, attaching the IT access logs, Ferris's signed addendum to the operative note, and sworn statements from Marcus, Phil Garrett, the anesthesiologist, and Ferris herself. Garrett's statement was 4 pages and described the sequence of events in the OR from the position of someone who had been watching the surgical field from 18 inches away for the entirety of the case. He described Wolk's freeze. He described the rate of hemorrhage. He described Rebecca entering the room, scrubbing, moving to the table, and the hemorrhage slowing. He described it with the meticulous accuracy of a man who had spent 30 years in operating rooms, and whose professional identity was built on remembering exactly what happened and exactly when. Vance submitted his patient statement through Okafor's office. It was precise and factual, and did not claim more than he could accurately attest to. He had been unconscious for the relevant sequence, and his statement said so. And then it described what Solis had told him and what Solis had witnessed through the OR window. And it described the IT logs and what they showed about when and how the recording had been degraded. The board investigation and the hospital's internal review ran on parallel tracks for 19 days. On the 14th day, Harwick's legal office contacted Okafor with a proposal. Rebecca declined it without reading past the first paragraph, because the first paragraph began with language about mutual agreement to resolve the matter without findings, which was the language institutions used when they wanted the problem to disappear, rather than the truth to be established. And the truth being established was the only outcome she was willing to accept. Okafor told her it would cost her more time. I know, Rebecca said. And more uncertainty. I know that too. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. Then we keep going. They kept going. On the 19th day, Harwick's CMO requested a meeting with Okafor that did not include Wolk or Wolk's attorney, which was the first indication that the institutional alignment had shifted. CMOs did not meet privately with opposing counsel unless they were separating from the position they had previously been defending. Okafor went to the meeting alone. She called Rebecca afterward. The CMO received a formal inquiry this morning from the Wyoming Attorney General's Healthcare Fraud Unit, Okafor said. The IT accesses logs were referred to them by the board investigator who reviewed our filing. Accessing and degrading hospital records under your own credential 3 minutes before the administrative authorization you yourself requested. That's not a gray area, Rebecca. The investigator referred it within 48 hours of receiving our documentation. Rebecca sat at her kitchen table with her coffee. What does that mean for the board complaint? She asked. The board investigation is ongoing, regardless of the criminal referral. But the hospital's internal review has produced its preliminary findings. Okafor paused. Wolk's surgical privileges have been suspended pending the completion of both investigations. He has been placed on administrative leave. The CMO's office is preparing a formal acknowledgement that the administrative hold on the OR recording was improperly authorized and that the initiation of the compression process prior to that hold constituted an unauthorized alteration of hospital records. She listened to all of it. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had expected something like satisfaction, the clean, definitive sense of an account being settled. What she felt was more complicated than that, less clean. The way most true things were less clean than their anticipated versions. The board complaint, she said. Wolk's original filing. Given the findings regarding his operative note and the recording, the board has opened a parallel investigation into his conduct. The complaint against you remains active until the board closes it, but our filing has shifted the evidentiary weight significantly. Okafor's voice was direct. I won't tell you it's over. It's not over. But the ground has moved. When will the board rule? 4 to 6 weeks. Maybe less, given the referral. She thanked Okafor and sat with her coffee for a long time after she hung up. 4 to 6 weeks was not a short time. It was not a short time to be suspended from the work she had structured her life around. Not a short time to be reduced to visitor status in a building where she had spent 6 years doing the most necessary things she knew how to do. She understood that. She also understood that the alternatives accepting the settlement, allowing Wolk's version to stand, letting the board close the case on terms that preserved his record and erased. Hers was not something her body would have allowed, even if her mind had been willing. Some things couldn't be agreed to. She had learned that a long time before Wyoming, in a different context, and with higher stakes, and the lesson had been thorough enough that it didn't require revisiting. She finished her coffee. She went for a run. 3 weeks after the CMO's meeting with Okafor, on a Tuesday morning that was warmer than most Aprils in Callaway, Rebecca was sitting on the front steps of her house with a second coffee when her phone rang. It was a number she recognized as the hospital's main administrative line. The voice on the other end was the VP of Medical Affairs, a woman named Sandra Hollis, whom Rebecca had spoken to exactly twice in 6 years, and who now spoke with the particular careful formality of someone delivering a message that had been reviewed by legal counsel before being communicated. Ms. Hale. The board of directors met yesterday evening and reviewed the preliminary findings of both the internal review and the board investigation. A pause. The findings are favorable to you. The suspension has been lifted. Your badge access has been restored, and the hospital would like to arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience. Rebecca looked at the street in front of her house. A neighbor's dog was pulling at its leash. 2 houses down, someone was mowing a lawn that didn't particularly need mowing. What does the meeting concern? She asked. Several things, Hollis said, including an apology, and a proposal we'd like to discuss with you in person. She said she would come in Thursday. She hung up and sat on her steps for a while longer, not thinking about Thursday or the meeting or what the proposal might be. She thought about the neighbor's dog, which had stopped pulling and was sitting very still in the middle of the sidewalk, staring at something only it could see, with the complete arrested attention of an animal that had found something worth its total concentration. She understood the feeling. The formal findings were published the following week, and they were specific in the way that formal findings are specific when the evidence has been thorough enough to leave no room for comfortable ambiguity. The Wyoming Nursing Board closed its investigation into Rebecca Hale with a finding of no violation. The board's written determination noted, that the intervention in OR 2 had occurred under conditions of immediate life-threatening emergency, that physician oversight had been established upon the arrival of Dr. Ferris and retroactively affirmed by her documented assessment of the clinical actions taken, and that the practitioner's decision to intervene was consistent with the ethical obligations of a healthcare professional facing an imminent patient death, where no credentialed alternative was taking effective action. It's also noted in a separate section that was not required but had been included anyway, that the training documented in Rebecca's military service record, the hemorrhage control certifications, the vascular procedure training completed under the Extended Battlefield Care Program, represented a level of preparation that, while not reflected in her civilian credentialing file at Harwick, was directly relevant to understanding the competence with which she had acted. The board's finding regarding Wolk's complaint was a single sentence. The complaint is dismissed in its entirety. The Wyoming Attorney General's Healthcare Fraud Unit's investigation into the OR recording alteration was ongoing and would take longer. These things always took longer, but ongoing was different from closed, and the distinction mattered in ways that would continue to matter for Harrison Wolk for a period considerably longer than the 19 days Rebecca had spent suspended. The hospital's internal review found that Wolk's operative note contained material misstatements regarding the sequence of clinical decision-making during the hemorrhage control phase. The finding used careful language material misstatements rather than falsification, which was deliberate and lawyerly, but the substance of it was plain. He had written something that wasn't true and signed his name to it, and then he had accessed a server under his own credential to degrade the recording that would have shown it wasn't true. And the combination of those two actions had produced a situation that no amount of institutional loyalty or surgical reputation could make navigable. His surgical privileges were suspended, pending the Attorney General's investigation. He resigned from the medical staff 4 days later, which Okafor told Rebecca was the expected sequence. The resignation was not voluntary in any meaningful sense of the word, but it was tidier than the alternative for everyone involved, and tidiness had its own institutional value. Harwick's board of directors issued a formal letter of apology to Rebecca. The letter was 2 pages. She read it once, noted that it was accurate in its account of what the hospital had failed to do and why, and put it in a drawer. She did not share it with anyone. Apologies that arrive after the fact are not the same as not requiring an apology, and she had never confused the two. The meeting with Sandra Hollis happened on Thursday as scheduled, in a conference room on the administrative floor, with a view of the parking structure she had sat in 3 times in the past 3 weeks. Hollis was there, the CMO doctor. Walter Brandt was there, a quiet man in his 60s who had spent the first 5 minutes of the meeting acknowledging his office's role in the administrative hold without using the word approving, which she noticed but chose not to address because Brandt was a man who was doing something genuinely difficult and doing it with something that resembled sincerity and that was worth accepting at something close to face value. The proposal was this. Harwick wanted to establish a formal trauma protocol, review program, a standing committee that would evaluate emergency interventions, examine scope of practice questions in real-time critical situations, and develop a framework for how the hospital handled the gap between clinical reality and credentialing structure in genuine emergencies. They wanted Rebecca to lead it, working alongside the nursing director and the department heads for trauma, surgery, and emergency medicine. They also wanted her back on the floor, not instead of the committee role, in addition to it. She looked at Hollis across the conference table. The committee role, she said. Is it advisory or does it have operational authority? Hollis glanced at Brandt. Operational, Brandt said. Recommendations have to go through the Medical Executive Committee for formal policy change. But the committee's findings would carry standing, not just suggestion. I'd want Ferris involved. We've already spoken with Dr. Ferris, Hollis said. She's agreed to co-chair the surgical component. Rebecca looked at the window. The parking structure was visible, the concrete levels ascending toward the pale Thursday sky. She thought about the dog on the sidewalk, the arrested attention, the thing only it could see. She thought about what she had come to Wyoming for 6 years ago, and whether the thing she had been protecting by staying invisible was actually being protected by invisibility, or whether it had simply been waiting, patient, accumulated, too large stay, contained indefinitely for a night, when the situation made the question of containment irrelevant. There's a condition, she said. Hollis and Brandt waited. The protocol framework we develop it can't just apply to Harwick. It needs to be submittable to the state health authority as a model for rural facilities statewide. Harwick isn't the only regional hospital that's going to face this kind of situation. It's just the one that faced it first and had the documentation to learn from it. She paused. If we build something, we build something that matters outside this building. Hollis looked at Brandt. Brandt looked at Rebecca. That would require significantly more work, he said. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, draft the scope and we'll take it to the board. She accepted the position on a Thursday and was back on the floor for the Friday night shift, which was exactly the way she had wanted it. No ceremony, no announcement to the unit beyond what Linda communicated in the handoff meeting. No gathering of staff in the break room for a cake she hadn't asked for and wouldn't have known what to do with. She clocked in. She checked her patients. She did the job. Linda caught her at the nursing station at around 2 in the morning, in the particular a quiet of a night shift, when the unit had settled, and there was a brief window before the next thing. How does it feel? Linda asked. Rebecca looked up from her chart. Like work, she said. Linda smiled. Good. She went to see Vance on Saturday morning. He was 6 weeks post-operative and had been cleared to return home 4 days earlier, but his discharge had been delayed by a flight scheduling issue that Solis described as administrative without further detail, which she understood to mean that someone had decided Vance should not travel until certain things were resolved and had used the scheduling system to accomplish that without explanation. He was in the same room. Room 6. Different configuration, the monitoring lines were gone, the SEU equipment replaced by the simpler furnishings of a standard recovery room. He was sitting in the chair by the window when she came in, not in the bed, wearing civilian clothes for the first time since she had met him. He looked like a man rather than a patient, which was the most reliable indicator that recovery was genuine. He looked up when she came in. I heard Thursday went well, he said. Solis, she said. Solis, he confirmed. She sat in the chair on the opposite side of the window. The morning was clear, the mountains visible, still snow-capped, still indifferent. I'm going home tomorrow, he said. Actually, this time. Good. My daughter is 9. She's been calling every day. He looked at his hands for a moment, the hands of a man who had done physical work for a long time, broad and marked. She wants to know what happened. I've been telling her I had an accident and got fixed. That's accurate, Rebecca said. It's not complete. He looked at her. I'm going to tell her the complete version eventually, when she's older. What will the complete version say? He thought about it for a moment, that there was a nurse who saw something everyone else missed, and who walked into a room she wasn't supposed to be in because she decided that the cost of staying outside was higher than the cost of going in. He paused, and that the people who tried to use the rules against her couldn't make the rules change what actually happened. She looked at the mountains. That's a better version than the official one, she said. The official one has too many words, he said, and not enough of the right ones. They sat in silence for a while. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had been in extreme proximity to each other's mortality and had come through to a calmer place and did not need to fill the space between. Them with sound to confirm they were both still there. The Lauric Valley, he said eventually. She didn't answer immediately. I know you didn't want to talk about it before, he said. You don't have to now. I wanted to say that I know what that was, what happened there. He stopped, and what it costs to carry something like that and still show up the way you showed up here. She looked at him. Some things you don't put down, she said. You just learn to carry them differently. He nodded. He understood that. She could see that he understood it with the specific comprehension of someone for whom it was not an abstraction. You're going to do good work, he said. The protocol program. I read about it. Solis sent me the summary. Of course he did. He's thorough. He's relentless, she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't entirely complaint. Vance almost smiled. That's why he's good at his job. He stood from the chair carefully, with the measured effort of a man whose body was still negotiating the terms of its recovery, and extended his hand. Thank you, Rebecca. She stood. She took his hand. She held it for a moment. Don't get shot again, she said. He laughed a short, genuine laugh that pulled at something in his chest and made him wince, but he was still laughing when the wince passed. I'll do my best, he said. The protocol framework took 8 months to draft, review, revise, and submit to the state health authority. Ferris co-chaired the surgical working group with the particular precision that Rebecca had come to expect from her concise, accurate, entirely without ego, the kind of collaborator who made the work better by refusing to let imprecision survive the editing process. Marcus joined the nursing subcommittee in his 4th year, having made the decision to stay at Harwick rather than transfer to a larger facility, a decision he made quietly and did not explain at length to anyone. The framework was adopted professional as a model guideline by the Wyoming Department of Health 14 months after Rebecca had sat across from Sandra Hollis and said she wanted something that matters outside the building. 14 months was not fast. It was also not slow, given what the process required and how many institutions had to agree on language that protected patients, without dismantling the credentialing structures that also protected patients, which was the genuinely hard problem at the center of it, and the one she had not pretended was easy. The Attorney General's investigation into Harrison Wolk concluded 16 months after the referral. The findings were not published in full, but the outcome was his Wyoming medical license was revoked following a determination of professional misconduct and evidence tampering. He did not contest the revocation, which was the choice of a man whose attorney had told him clearly what contesting it would look like and how it would end. Rebecca did not read the announcement when it came out. Okafor sent it to her. She glanced at the first paragraph, confirmed the outcome, and set her phone down. She was in the middle of a simulation exercise with a group of second-year residents and 2 Slunson residents, had 2 surgical fellows working through a hemorrhage control scenario that she had designed herself, and the scenario was at a critical point, and the residents needed to think through the next decision without her providing the answer. One of the fellows, a young woman named Devlin, who had the particular quality of intense focus combined with Daislick's barely contained urgencies from her own early years, made up a dissection about clamp placement that was almost right and slightly wrong in a way that mattered. Stop, Rebecca said. Devlin stopped. Where are you placing it? Proximal to the tear, for hemostasis, and what happens to the tissue distal to your clamp while you work? Devlin thought. Continued ischemia. For how long? Until I complete the repair. And if completion takes longer than you estimate? A pause. Devlin looked at the simulated anatomy. She looked at the clamp in her hand. She looked at the problem from the angle Rebecca was pointing her toward. And Rebecca watched the moment when the understanding arrived not just intellectually but functionally. The understanding that would still be present when the real version of this situation appeared and the lights were worse and the pressure was higher and there was no simulation reset button. I need a second clamp, Devlin said. Distal control. To protect the tissue while I work. Yes, Rebecca said. She stepped back and let Devlin continue. Around the simulation table, 3 residents watched. They were learning not just the technical sequence, but the thing underneath the technical sequence, the thing that couldn't be taught directly, but could be demonstrated, how to see the whole problem, not just the immediate one, how to think past the current action to its consequence, how to stay inside the emergency rather than being consumed by it. She watched them work. She had been a lot of things in her life. She had been a forward surgical nurse in environments where the stakes of a wrong decision were not administrative, but absolute. She had been the person that other people didn't account for, underestimated by professional rank, by job title, by the quiet that she had always found more efficient than noise. She had been suspended, accused, bureaucratically erased, and reestablished, and she had come through all of it without being changed in the ways that mattered and changed in the ways that were necessary. She was not at peace with everything in her past. The Larak Valley was not a thing she had made peace with, and she did not expect to. Some events did not resolve into peace. They resolved into something you could live alongside, something that informed rather than controlled. And that was the best available outcome. And she had accepted it as enough, because enough was what reality offered. And she had never been someone who required more than what reality offered. What she had was this room, these residents, this problem that mattered. Devlin completed the repair correctly. Rebecca told her it was correct and moved on to the next scenario without dwelling on it, because dwelling was not too useful, and there was another decision, waiting, that required full attention. After the session ended and the residents had gone, Ferris appeared in the doorway of the simulation lab. How were they? She asked. The fellow is good, Rebecca said. The residents need more repetitions. They always need more repetitions. Yes. Ferris leaned against the doorframe. She looked around the lab, the equipment, the simulation anatomy, the table that Rebecca had spent 3 months designing with the clinical education department to replicate the specific conditions and points where emergency trauma interventions most commonly went wrong. It was not a glamorous room. It was a functional one, which was what she had asked for. Do you remember? Ferris said, what you told me when we were designing this program. What you said you wanted people to leave here knowing. Rebecca picked up a clamp from the instrument tray and set it back in its correct position. I said I wanted them to know what to do before they needed to do it, she said, so that when the moment came, they weren't learning. They were remembering. Ferris nodded. That's happening, she said. Rebecca looked at the table, at the instruments, at the room that hadn't existed a year ago and would outlast both of them in one form or another, the knowledge it generated, the decisions it would prevent, the patients who would never know they had been protected by something that happened in a simulation lab in a regional hospital in Wyoming. Because a nurse had walked a door she was supposed to walk through and refused to accept the consequences that someone with more authority had tried to make inevitable. She didn't think of it as a legacy. Legacy was a word for retrospectives, and she was not interested in retrospectives. She thought of it as work. There was still more of it to do, which was the only thing that had ever really motivated her, not recognition, not vindication, not the satisfaction of having been right when someone else was wrong, but the simple, durable, sometimes brutal fact that the work existed, and she was capable of doing it, and therefore she would. She placed the last instrument on the tray. She turned off the simulation table. She picked up her bag. The thing about being underestimated, the thing nobody who had never experienced it fully understood, was that it was not only a disadvantage. It created a particular kind of freedom. When no one is watching you closely, you can see everything. When no one expects much, you can prepare without interruption. When the room has already decided you're not the most important person in it, you can spend your attention on the actual problem rather than on managing how the room perceives you. Rebecca Hale had spent her life being the person in the room that the room did not account for. She had stopped minding that a long time ago. She walked out of the simulation lab. She walked out of the simulation lab and down the corridor toward the nursing unit, where her shift started in 40 minutes. And she did not look back at the room she had built, because it was behind her now, and what was in front of her still required everything she had. That was enough. That had always been enough.